So this is living proof, if you already didn't need it, that your government may not always be right. Yeah, no, it is shocking, I know, it is shocking. Especially if they're going to put it, like this in a plaque, you'd think, well, it's the truth. Anyway, yeah, so this is a story here. Sir James Yeo, there's a neighborhood named after him on the mountain. Yeah. And that neighborhood actually is where the spring for Shadok Creek is. I got a book called Daylighting Shadok, and I didn't realize at the time this was him, but it's called Yeoville, that neighborhood. Mohawk, Link, Upper James, and West Fifth. Basically that square. So he's a captain, or whatever, Commodore, British Navy. He has ships in Toronto Harbor. Comes out, there's a bunch of Americans there, and the Americans give chase. And they chase him all the way to this end of the lake. And the story came down that there was a storm, and it rose the waters. At that time, where the channel is now didn't exist. It was at the end of the bar, right where it meets, right where the hospital is now, basically. That's where the channel was. So because there was a storm that came from the east, it raised the waters, and Commodore Yeo, with the help of a young boy, and these boys on ships could be very young, like 10, 12, who knew the waters, he got the ship through the channel into the safety of the bay, and protected by the guns there that were here. So, as it turns out, it was impossible for that to happen, because the draft of those ships that he had was much too great, and the channel was way too shallow. It never could have happened. I'm surprised this is still here, because it's been pretty conclusively shown that it's not possible. So what we're walking on right now is the Iroquois sand and gravel bar. And for most people wouldn't know it exists, really. And I only know it exists because at some point I had to ask myself why, when I'm driving on York Boulevard here, I'm 100 feet above water level. Like, what is that all about? And I did some investigation and found out that this was actually a glacial sandbar from the last glaciers when they left, which is 12 to 15,000 years ago. Basically the time span of Niagara Falls. That's how long it's taken Niagara Falls to get from the front of the edge of the escarpment back to where it is now. Those 15,000 years. Wow. But this was created by the glacial lake that was here at that time. And it's become, it's been a corridor into Hamilton, since Hamilton started, before Hamilton was here. And a busy corridor, busier and busier. It is also known as Burlington Heights, this section, from Dundurn Castle on, because in the 1700s, late 1700s, this became a British Army encampment, because the lieutenant governor at that time knew the Americans were going to invade. And so he needed a place for the army to be based, a safe place that would be defendable, as this was. And so this reminded him of a place back in England where he came from, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. And so he came here, checking the place out. And when he was here, he and his wife, Elizabeth, stayed with Richard and Harriet Beasley, who lived down below beside the water. They had this house down there, and he located it there because it was a terminus for a portage at a time when people were traveling by water and overland on foot you know, there weren't highways, there weren't cars. And this portage is one of the most interesting things that I found, really, because it's on the earliest maps of North America, and it runs from this point over Hamilton, down across Shadoke Creek and across Main Street up onto the escarpment, and then it goes to the Grand River by Brantford. And then from there you go up the Grand River to another portage that takes you to the Thames. All this takes only about a day, all this walking. And then the Thames will take you to Lake St. Clair. And that means that you have gotten past Niagara Falls, which is always an impediment to canoe travel, and also Lake Erie, which is shallow, and it gets storms frequently, so it's not easy to cross on a canoe. But this portage shows up on maps from ages ago, from the earliest maps of North America, like I said. So it's one of the reasons why he put his trading post down there. And from what I understand, it was kind of like Sobe bikes, except for canoes. You could park your canoe there, and then gather your gear and walk over to the Grand River, and there'd be another canoe waiting for you there. You just had to punch in the little code, and then. You probably all know about the Round the Bay race and the countless number of times that it's promoted as the oldest road race in North America, because it precedes the Boston Marathon by 1 year, though it's not actually a marathon. The Round the Bay isn't. They got the bridge rebuilt in time for them to be able to use it, and my daughter actually did half of the road race starting from Eastport Drive, so she came up Heartbreak Hill, which she said really wasn't a heartbreak at all, so maybe that's misnamed too. But one of the original winners in the Olympics was of the marathon. When they reinstituted the Olympics in 1896, some of the first racers to win races there, like the marathon, came from Hamilton. So, and Billy Shearing was one of them. Kind of amazing. I mean, he trained in Hamilton. I live right beside Victoria Park. He used Victoria Park for training. Hamilton was kind of known at the time as an athletic place. A lot of that started because the late 19th century is when all the industry started, right? Didn't start with steel, but steel was part of it. There were a lot of that kind of activity. So there were a lot of young men, often living together in small houses, and then working shifts, and then they had to have something to do with their free time and on weekends. And that's when you start seeing the development of sports. And that's when a lot of that started with the churches. So like you get a church in our neighborhood like Erskine, which is now a Presbyterian church. It started out as Wesleyan Methodist. But they build they build a gym next to it. And a lot of the basketball leagues and the baseball leagues and the hockey leagues, many of them were church-based. So they were trying to give these young guys something to do with all that free time so they wouldn't be getting into trouble. This is one of the original markers from the Round the Bay, the 17-mile mark. So you can tell it's not really anywhere near a marathon because we're very close to the finish line here, and the marathon's 26 miles. Hamilton Herald was the newspaper at the time. Hamilton had at least 2, maybe 3 newspapers, and the Hamilton Herald was the one that originally sponsored the Round the Bay race, same way the Spectator does now.
When I was in grade 8 at Gibson School, I ran with some friends the 26 miles.
Oh, did you?
I started out with all my friends, and we were just skipping along and running, and it was great, and everybody was dressed well, to do this race. Not us. And as my friends dropped out of the race, I kept on going, thinking, well, I'm pretty close. I made it to the end. I couldn't walk. My father picked me up, put me in his arms, took me to the car. And the next day, and I blisters, stayed in bed for a day or two. My father feeding me soup, very proud of me. And the Spectator wrote, youngest boy to come in.
Really?
Grand race.
Martyn Kendrick.
Martyn Kendrick.
Wow, there you go. Very good. Wow. When I started finding out about the Iroquois bar, it started because I worked just on the other side there in someone's barn. I had a small shop there, and I would take this route every day. And it never occurred to me to wonder, why am I 100 feet above water level. You know, like what is that? A friend of mine later said he thought that this was just a causeway that the city had built. You know, dump truck loads and dump truck loads. All of this landscape around here, other than the escarpment, is created by water. That's water either flowing, rushing after the glaciers are melting, or it's ice itself making all the little hills in the Dundas Valley, or it's the currents of the, like Lake Iroquois would have been that higher. If you imagine a sandbar, we would be standing probably on dry ground now, but the water would be right over there, and the currents would be creating, making this bigger, you know, all of that kind of stuff. It's all a water created environment, the hand of water. It's just kind of mind-boggling. This cut here, the canal that we so lovingly call the Desjardins Canal, it almost seems French. It was never here. This is not an act of nature here. This was made in 1853. Around there. It had to do with the railway coming to town, because the railway came in through up there and then all along there and came, and McNabb, some people think McNabb made sure that when it got through Dundas, it was too high to be usable by Dundas. So that's why the station is so much higher. You know where it is, where the old station for Dundas is? So then it slowly comes down here and comes in here, and it has to cross right over here. This canal was built by Dundas, and that's because they were the industrial center, and they used to go around the end, around there where you see the Valley Bridge and that embankment there. The water used to way over there, and just past that to the left there's that sloping embankment. On the other side of the embankment is the continuation of the water, and it goes all the way around to there. That's how ships used to go in and out. And then when the railway was built, they had to provide a way for the ships to get to Dundas. And that's when this was dug out. That's when this was dug out, which also necessitated all these bridges over the years. Untold numbers of bridges here, bridges after bridges. But this bridge was too low for ships to get to Dundas. So they had to make one that lifted, but shipping, canals, that was kind of over as soon as the railways came anyway. You know, it was all about the railway. And that's what started Hamilton as a site. Dundas had preceded it industrially, but then everything shifted to Hamilton. And in my book, Dundas owes Hamilton a lot of thanks, because that town went to sleep and then preserved all its architecture downtown. It's a beautiful little town, which, mark my words, they would not be if they had stayed the center of the universe like they were, you know? But instead we got it all here. So they don't feel truly grateful to Hamilton, but you know, maybe one day they will. Who knows? That's the famous bridge, the one down there from 1857 when the train coming from Toronto, the axle broke and the train plunged into the canal and 60 some odd people died. It was the worst train accident in the British Empire up until that time. They had those lithographs that they would send around the world, and that's the famous scenes from what happened here. But 1857 was also the time that the first bridge here, which was a suspension bridge, blew itself apart. The wind caught underneath it and it just started rolling like this and then just shattered, you know? So then that was gone. So then they built another bridge here, but nobody felt very comfortable about that bridge, so people wouldn't use it, you know? So the toll road company, which owned the right of way here, built another bridge, their own, which actually the roadway is down there, and it crossed right beside that railway bridge. If you're on the waterfront trail, you can still see the stone abutments of this other bridge that was down there. And it wasn't until 1895 that they built a bridge here that people were confident to cross. And then that bridge, whew, was replaced in 1932 by what we've got here. So, and this bridge was part of this overall plan that was initiated not solely, but primarily by my hero, Thomas B. McQuestion.
That's my hero.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He lived at Whitehorn downtown. Never married, lived with his mom. His father was instrumental in building McNabb Presbyterian, just on the other side of the railway tracks. When he was young, that's when the THMB came through and divided the house from the railway tracks. So that wall that's between Whitehorn and Hunter Street, they built that wall with the expropriation money. So he knew what trains could do to the landscape, to the urban landscape, to the landscape you love and live in. And so he saw cars coming and he knew it would be the same story. So that's why he created these roads like the Parkway and this sort of thing to elevate everything and to preserve a landscape, right? That otherwise was going to get industrialized very quickly. The famous niches, yes. Originally when it was designed, well, in the first place, this version of the bridge is a real minimalist version of what they first envisioned. They had a competition and the person that won it, like this, was entirely different, much more elaborate and much and bigger. And there was a restaurant over here, there was viewing platforms, all kinds of stuff, you know? And then it was 1929. So this is what it got reduced to, you know? But those niches originally, it was going to be decided who would fill those niches. There's 4 of them. So let's start. Bob Bratina. That would be good. That would be good. Bob Bratina. I don't even know who you'd pick. You know, these days. But well, yeah, but that wouldn't fly. I doubt that would fly. But that would be a good one. I think you probably need. It would. The safest thing to do would be to have animals in there. So this is an interesting spot too, because historically, this is where the glaciers advanced and receded. It's through Dundas Valley. You know, so you see any of these maps of the old glacial lakes that used to be here, and there's always this tongue right here, like coming back and forth. So it's a much worked landscape. And it's also, I don't know how many hundreds of feet down to bedrock. Like down, it's just so far. When they built the railway, when the railway first came to town and they had to cross from Dundas across the outlet there, they worked for 2 years trying to putting fill in the water, but it all just disappeared because there was no bottom. And in the end, the only thing that got them, that they were able to do, was throw tree stumps, you know, with the roots on them that people used to, when they were digging up trees, you get the stump, big thing. They piled those in there, and then they could put landfill on top of that, and then they started coming up out of the ground. So when they built the 403, then they actually used vacuum cleaners, big honking vacuum cleaners. I don't know if you've ever taken that little road off of here, Old Guelph Road, to get to the Arboretum. You know, you go down, it goes like that, and it goes under the 403. Then on the right-hand side is Mercer's Glen. There used to be a sign there that said Mercer's Glen. And that's because the Mercers, a family, used to have 3 little shacks underneath the railway embankment there, and they lived there. And then by the time the 403 was built, The ministry had gotten rid of anybody that lived there. And by anybody, I mean also the first caretaker of the rock garden. He lived on the other side of the road, and that's where the original lilac dell was. But then when they were building the 403, they used this big vacuum cleaner and sucked out the bottom of the marsh and poured it into Mercer's Glen. And so Mercer's Glen level rose until, I don't know, a number of years ago, you'd see guys there, German guys there in the winter using what ice there was to play it looked like curling with a handle on top of it. They used to play that there, but usually it's just dry because it's, they built it up so high. So where the rock garden is now, that was a quarry which they used when they built the highway. When they built York Road, which is Highway 2 going to Toronto, the Toronto-Hamilton Highway in like 1917. But when they wanted to turn it into a garden, that rock comes from King's Forest. They got that from King's Forest. I don't know what they were doing, maybe making the golf course, because I think that's another McQuestion thing. So yeah, that's where they got that rock from, was to put there. Yeah, it's all connected. Anyway, I think I'm spent now. I think that's it. That's all you're getting from me. Well, thank you for being so attentive and adding.
So much information.
So yeah, this is actually my place here. This landscape sucked me in whenever it was, years ago now. And in a way, I haven't stopped and don't seem to be able to stop writing about it. I do tours of the Iroquois bar here, my sandbar. They usually start in the parking lot here and they go to the high level bridge. It's very familiar territory to me. And these days when I start, I like to read, I've written a few acknowledgements, land acknowledgements that are they're a little different than the ones we normally hear. And this one I call an acknowledgement close to the ground. We are gathered on the traditional territory of people who live close to the ground, who touch and are intimate with this patch of earth, its waters, who know and name the many more and wild animals with whom they share life and death here as sisters and brothers, who follow its creeks, who dwell in the beauty of this place in ways we only imagine, bound as we are to the streets of the city and to the paths of settlement. When I originally wrote Falling into Place, it included a poem in it, and this poem kind of encapsulates, I think, for me, I guess, my feeling for the place. And it's called Giants. There used to be giants, and they loved it here. They'd sit their giant hinds in a row along the top edge of the escarpment and pick at the loose rock with their hands or their feet, then throw or skip the smoothest stones across the bay to see who could land one on the sand strip 3 miles away. Or they'd spring themselves off the scarp top like you would off a low wall and go running all the way to the end of the sandbar and jump across the water to the other side, or jump in, splashing and yelling up the ravines, chasing each other's echoes. This was only a few thousand years ago, and the giants were still excited about the glaciers, which were just leaving, about not having to wear their coats all the time, and what the ice and water had done, shaping and carving this gentle, wild landscape. They loved it here. I'm telling you, they absolutely loved every living minute here. And they regretted ever having to leave. Thanks.
That's why you're here, John. It is the last episode, Tales of Paradise Marsh. Last episode for this season. We've barely begun to scratch the surface of what we'd like to do. And to have John on this last show, John Terpstra, our great writer, a steward of this area, who's been writing for decades about the voices that are held here in this landscape, not just human voices, animal voices, the voice of rock and water. It's been a beautiful way to end, John. We haven't yet done what John calls daylighting Shidok, and that's to take, say, these streams and to re-wild them, to unbury them. And we'd love to go there with you, John, to actually visualize and show what is and what can and what will be done.
And I'd love to take you.
Okay. And on that note, thank you all. We'll see you next year. I mean, really, it's been a great, great season. Scott, our producer, I want to thank you too, and all the guests who have been here. I'm Martyn Kendrick. Adios. See you next season.
And goodbye from me too. But this land remained in as British government land until Confederation, so 1867, and that's when they gave this piece of land to the city. Hamilton became a city in 1846, and this was given to the city then. It had already been used for a burying ground for soldiers, and then also for one of the cholera epidemics in 1832. And so that's when this actually became, all up there, became, like I said before, the first municipal cemetery in the country.